An interrogation room in the Los Angeles County Jail. November 2012. The dull beige walls reflect the cold fluorescent light. Seated at a metal table, a heavy-set, 72-year-old man, nearly 6 feet 6 inches tall, begins to speak with unsettling calm. His voice is deep, almost contemplative. Samuel Little doesn't seem nervous. He isn't sweating. He isn't trembling. He is simply recounting, with chilling precision, how he strangled a woman in 1993. But that's not the most disturbing thing. What's truly chilling is that he keeps talking. And talking. And talking. The detectives exchange incredulous glances. 1 victim. 2 victims. 10. 20. The names, the cities, the years pile up like a macabre list that seems to have no end. When he finally pauses, the number has reached proportions that defy comprehension. 93 women. 93 lives extinguished by the hands of a single man. At that moment, investigators face a question that will change the criminal history of the United States. Is it possible that this elderly man is the most prolific serial killer in the country's history? Samuel Little doesn't fit the Hollywood stereotype of serial killers. He wasn't a manipulative genius like Hannibal Lecter. He wasn't a terrifying clown like John Wayne Gacy. For decades, Samuel Little was something far more dangerous, invisible. He was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, during the height of racial segregation. His childhood was chaotic, marked by neglect and instability. Raised primarily by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio, Little grew up in an environment with little supervision and limited opportunities. From a young age, he displayed violent tendencies, particularly toward women. At 16, he already had his first arrest for theft. It was just the beginning of a criminal career that would span more than 6 decades. But his early crimes were minor: robberies, assaults, fraud. The authorities saw him as a common criminal, a petty offender who moved in and out of the penal system like a revolving door. No one suspected that while serving sentences for robbery, he had already begun to kill. During the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, Samuel Little roamed the United States like a ghost. He had no fixed address. He didn't hold steady jobs. He lived in cheap motels, homeless shelters, and sometimes on the streets. His imposing height and physical strength made him an intimidating presence, but he had learned to navigate the shadows of society. He developed a method that would allow him to kill for decades without being detected. He sought out vulnerable women, prostitutes, drug addicts, the homeless. Women who, in cynical but accurate words, no one would miss. He lured them with promises of money, drugs, or simply a place to spend the night. Then, in the privacy of a car or a motel room, he strangled them with his bare hands. He didn't use weapons. He didn't leave much forensic evidence. And most importantly, he chose victims that the police systems of the time frequently ignored or investigated superficially. Little took advantage of a systemic flaw in U.S. law enforcement: the lack of communication between jurisdictions and the implicit bias in which victims deserved investigative resources. Throughout his life, Samuel Little was arrested more than 100 times in at least 26 states. Robberies, assaults, rapes, kidnappings. His criminal record was extensive, but fragmented. Each arrest occurred in a different city, under a different police jurisdiction. In the era before integrated computerized databases, this information was rarely shared efficiently between agencies. In 1982, he was arrested in Mississippi, accused of strangling a 26-year-old woman named Melinda Rose Lapre. The evidence was strong, but a jury found him not guilty. Little had perfected his ability to present himself in court: polite, calm, almost likable. And his victims, when they survived to testify, were frequently discredited by their life stories. 2 years later, in 1984, he was arrested again, this time in San Diego, accused of the murder of 22-year-old Patricia Ann Mount and the attempted murder of 22-year-old Lori Barros. But again, the prosecution was unable to build a sufficiently strong case. The charges were eventually dismissed. The system failed repeatedly, and with each failure, Samuel Little gained confidence. Between 1970 and 2012, Samuel Little crisscrossed the country, leaving a trail of death that remained hidden in disconnected police files. He killed in California, Texas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Ohio, and many other states. His victims ranged in age from 14 to 46. All were women. Most were African American. In many cases, the deaths were misclassified as overdoses, accidents, or natural causes. When homicide was suspected, investigations frequently stalled due to a lack of evidence or resources. Bodies were found in alleys, vacant lots, garbage containers, and rural roads. Some were never identified. Little had found the perfect formula: choose marginalized victims, kill without weapons, move constantly, and take advantage of systemic failures in police communication. For 40 years, he was virtually invincible. But everything changed in September 2012. Samuel Little was arrested at a Louisville, Kentucky, safe house on suspicion of drug use. It was just another routine arrest in his long criminal history. However, this time something was different. His DNA was entered into CODIS, the FBI's national database of genetic profiles. Days later, a match was found. Little's DNA matched evidence collected at 3 unsolved crime scenes in the Los Angeles, California area, dating from 1987 and 1989. The victims were Carol Alford, 41, Audrey Nelson, 35, and Guadalupe Apodaca, 46. After decades of evading justice, science had finally caught up with Samuel Little. He was extradited to California and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. He faced the possibility of life imprisonment. But even then, no one imagined the true magnitude of his crimes. Detectives from the Los Angeles Police Department knew they had enough evidence to convict Little of 3 murders. But something about the suspect's profile made them suspect there was more. Much more. The case was assigned to Detective Mitzi Roberts, a veteran investigator with experience in cold cases. Roberts adopted an unconventional strategy. She didn't pressure Little aggressively. Instead, she treated him with respect, even a certain cordiality. She brought him coffee. They talked about his childhood, about art. Little was a talented draftsman, about his travels around the country. Slowly, Samuel Little began to open up. He seemed to enjoy the attention. After decades of being invisible, someone was finally interested in his story. And he, at 72 years old and facing the end of his life, decided he wanted to be remembered. Not as a petty criminal, but as the biggest one. In November 2012, during one of these informal sessions, Samuel Little made a casual comment that chilled the blood of the researchers. Those 3 are not the only ones. Roberts remained calm. He asked her to elaborate. Little smiled slightly and began to speak. A woman in Miami in 1984. Another in Pascagoula in 1982. One more in Los Angeles in 1987. The details flowed with disturbing ease. During the following weeks, the confessions continued. Little described his victims with photographic precision: the color of their hair, the clothes they wore, where he had met them, how he had killed them, where he had left their bodies. He didn't remember names. He never asked for their names, but he remembered everything else. The investigators listened with growing horror as the number climbed. 10 victims. 20. 30. 40. Where would this macabre list end? On September 13, 2013, Samuel Little went on trial for the 3 murders in Los Angeles. Although the crimes had occurred decades earlier, the evidence was solid: DNA, witness testimony, and Little's own confessions. On September 25, 2013, the jury found him guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. A month later, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Samuel Little, 73 years old, would spend the rest of his life in prison. But his story was far from over. In fact, It was only just beginning to unfold in all its horrific magnitude. Because while Little was serving his sentence in California State Prison, he kept talking, and the number of victims kept growing. Investigators began to suspect they weren't dealing with a simple serial killer. They were facing the most prolific killer in the history of the United States. How many more women actually died at the hands of Samuel Little? And why did he finally decide to confess after decades of silence? California State Prison, 2014. In his cell, Samuel Little spends his time drawing. He uses colored pencils provided by the prison and ordinary paper. His strokes are surprisingly skillful, almost artistic. But what he draws is disturbing: women's faces. Dozens of faces. Each one different. Each one with specific details: the shape of the eyes, the hairstyle, the angle of the smile. Some wear distinctive earrings. Others have freckles or particular marks. Little draws them from memory, recreating faces she saw decades ago, in some cases 40 or 50 years before. These are not imaginary drawings. They are portraits of his victims. And his memory for visual detail is chilling in its accuracy. Detective Mitzi Roberts continues her visits. Now Little speaks more freely. He describes each murder as if he were narrating scenes from a movie. He remembers where he bought gas before meeting a victim in Tennessee. He remembers the exact color of the coat a woman was wearing in Ohio. He remembers the song that was playing on his car radio when he strangled someone in Georgia. It is an extraordinary memoir dedicated to the catalog of horror. In 2017, the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP, began taking Samuel Little's confessions more seriously. VICAP is a national database specifically designed to identify patterns among violent crimes committed in different jurisdictions. VICAP analyst Angelo Camacho was assigned to interview Little. Camacho had access to decades of cold cases from across the country. His mission was to verify whether Little's confessions corresponded to real, unsolved cases. What he discovered was astonishing. Little wasn't just confessing to crimes. He was providing details that only the killer could have known. He described the exact locations of bodies that had been found decades earlier. He recalled characteristics of the victims that matched old autopsies. He mentioned details of crime scenes that had never been made public. One by one, the confessions began to be verified. Cold cases that had remained unsolved for 20, 30, even 40 years, suddenly had answers. In November 2018, after months of extensive interviews, Samuel Little finally provided a complete figure. He had killed 93 women between 1970 and 2005. 93. The number surpassed that of any known serial killer in U.S. history. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, had confessed to 49 murders. Ted Bundy admitted to 30, though he was suspected of more. John Wayne Gacy killed 33 people. Samuel Little surpassed them all, and by a significant margin. On November 27, 2018, the FBI made an unprecedented announcement. They held a press conference where they presented the case publicly. For the first time, the name Samuel Little became national news. Images of his drawings were released. The FBI issued a public appeal for help in identifying victims whose cases had not yet been confirmed. The response was immediate. Police departments across the country began reviewing their cold case files. Families who had lost loved ones decades earlier suddenly had a possible explanation. Analyzing Little's confessions revealed a clear and chilling pattern. He selected victims with calculated precision. They weren't random women. They all shared specific characteristics that made them vulnerable and, in the context of law enforcement during those decades, disposable. Most worked in prostitution or had drug addictions. Many had no close family or were estranged from their loved ones. Several were transients, constantly moving between cities. A significant number had criminal records, which complicated investigations when their bodies were found. Little would approach them in high-crime areas, street corners known for prostitution, slums, near bus stations. He would offer them money or drugs. He quickly gained their trust. Then he would take them to secluded places in his car. The method of murder was consistent: manual strangulation. Little used his hands or forearm. He did not use ligatures or weapons. This left less forensic evidence and, in many cases, allowed the deaths to be misclassified as accidents or overdoses, especially if the victims had a history of drug use. Samuel Little killed in at least 19 different states. His mobility was an essential part of his method. He never stayed in one city long enough to establish a recognizable pattern. He would commit one murder and then move to another city, sometimes to another state entirely. California was his most prolific hunting ground, with approximately 40 confirmed or suspected kills. Florida was second, with over a dozen. Texas, Georgia, Ohio, Kentucky, Louisiana, and Mississippi all had victims. He traveled by bus or in stolen cars. He stayed in cheap motels, paying in cash. He used multiple aliases. At different times, he called himself Samuel McDowell, his mother's maiden name, Samuel Little, and Sam McDowell. This inconsistency in his identity further complicated the police investigation. During the 1970s and 1980s, interagency communication technology was primitive compared to today's standards. Computerized databases were rudimentary or non-existent. Most police departments maintained paper records. A detective in Los Angeles had no easy way of knowing that a similar case had occurred in Miami months earlier. Samuel Little exploited this systematic fragmentation with brutal effectiveness. When the FBI began releasing information about Little's victims, an uncomfortable truth surfaced. Many of these women were never reported missing. Their bodies were found, but the investigations were superficial or simply ignored. Mary Jo Brosley of Spring Hill, Florida, was found dead in 1984. Her death was ruled an overdose. It took more than 30 years and Little's confession to reclassify it as a homicide. Audrey Nelson of Los Angeles was found strangled in a dumpster in 1989. Her case remained unsolved until 2012, when Little's DNA was linked to it. Denise Christie Brothers of Odessa, Texas, disappeared in 1994. Her skeleton was found months later. The case had no suspects until Little confessed. These women had families. They had stories. But society, and often the criminal justice system, did not give them the same attention it would have given to victims from other demographics. The Samuel Little case exposed deep flaws in the American criminal justice system. He wasn't simply a skilled killer evading capture. He was an average killer taking advantage of systemic biases and a lack of resources. The phenomenon has a name in criminology: less dead, a term coined by researcher Stephen Egger. It refers to victims whose deaths receive less police and media attention due to their social status: homeless people, sex workers, drug users, and ethnic minorities. Studies have shown that homicide cases involving middle-class Caucasian victims are significantly more likely to be solved than those involving low-income African American or Latino victims. These cases receive less media coverage, and police departments allocate fewer investigative resources to them. Samuel Little understood this intuitively. In his confessions, he explicitly admitted that he chose victims he thought would not be missed. To help identify unconfirmed victims, the FBI enlisted Little's help in an unusual way. They provided him with improved art supplies and asked him to draw all the women he remembered killing. Little eagerly agreed. 4 months, he produced dozens of portraits. His drawings were strikingly detailed. Each face had distinctive features. The FBI began posting these portraits on its website and social media, hoping someone would recognize a missing loved one. The strategy worked. A portrait of an African American woman with short hair and prominent earrings was recognized by relatives in Cincinnati, Ohio. It matched a woman who had disappeared in 1981. Another drawing helped identify a victim in Covington, Kentucky. But there was something disturbing about the process. Little drew with clear satisfaction. He smiled as he recreated the faces. He commented on which victims had been more beautiful or more memorable. To him, these weren't people. They were trophies he collected in his memory and now transferred to paper. In April 2018, Samuel Little was transferred from California to Texas to face additional charges in the Odessa murders of Denise Christie brothers. In May of that year, he pleaded guilty and received another life sentence. Shortly afterward, he was transferred to a California Affordable Care Act facility as his health was rapidly deteriorating. He suffered from severe diabetes, heart problems, and other chronic conditions. By the age of 78, he was in irreversible physical decline. But his mind remained sharp. He continued to recall victims, providing details to investigators who visited him regularly. The FBI and local law enforcement agencies sent detectives with cold case files, seeking confirmation or new leads. By the end of 2019, the FBI had confirmed 50 of Little's 93 confessions. Investigations into the remaining victims continued, but many would likely never be fully verified. Records had been lost. The bodies were never found. The relevant police departments no longer existed due to municipal mergers. 93 confessions. 50 confirmed. 43 still under investigation. What was going through Samuel Little's mind when he killed? And why, after decades of silence, did he decide to confess everything? California State Prison, 2018 and 2019. A small room, institutional lighting, video cameras recording every word. Samuel Little, now 78, sits comfortably across from the investigators. His health is frail, but his memory remains intact. And he is eager to talk. The FBI has released transcripts and videos of these interviews. In them, Little describes his crimes with chilling casualness. He shows no remorse. He doesn't apologize. He simply narrates, like someone recalling vacations or old jobs. She was standing on the corner of Sunset Boulevard, he says of a victim in Los Angeles. She was wearing a red dress. I offered her a ride to wherever she needed to go. She got into my car without hesitation. The investigators ask him why he confessed after so much time. His answer is simple and disturbing, because I want it to be known. I want the credit for what I did. To understand Samuel Little, forensic psychologists analyzed his life history, searching for patterns. What they found was a nearly classic trajectory towards psychopathic behavior. He was born in Georgia in 1940, at the height of racial segregation in the southern United States. His mother, Bessie Mae Little, was a prostitute who used the surname McDowell. His father was never present. A few months after his birth, Samuel was sent to live with his grandmother in Ohio. According to Little's own words, his grandmother was strict but often absent. The boy spent long hours alone. From a young age, he displayed cruelty toward animals, a common early indicator in future serial killers. He also developed an obsession with hitting and physically controlling other children. At age 12, he had his first violent sexual encounter. He attacked a younger girl in his neighborhood. He was not arrested. The victim's family did not report the incident, a common occurrence in that time and community. During his adolescence, Samuel Little began to hone the skills he would later use to kill. He was charismatic when it suited him, able to quickly gain trust. But he was also violent, especially in intimate or private situations with women. At 16, he was arrested for the first time for burglary. He spent time in a juvenile detention center in Ohio. There he met more experienced criminals who taught him manipulation techniques and how to avoid capture. After his release, Little moved frequently between Ohio, Florida, and California. He did not complete high school. He worked odd jobs: dishwasher, longshoreman, gardener. But his main source of income was crime, petty theft, minor fraud, and occasional muggings. In 1960, at the age of 20, he was arrested for his first recorded violent sexual crime, attempted rape in Omaha, Nebraska. He served a short sentence. After his release, His attacks became more frequent and more violent. Samuel Little claims he committed his first murder in 1970, at the age of 30. According to his confession, it occurred near Miami, Florida. The victim was an African-American woman who worked as a prostitute. He strangled her in his car and left her body in an abandoned industrial area. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't even questioned. It's possible the body was never found, or that the death was misclassified. But something changed in Little that night. He described the experience as intoxicating. He had crossed a line from which he would never return. For the next 35 years, he would kill again and again, frequently increasing the frequency during periods of high mobility. Psychologists who analyzed his case identified classic characteristics of the antisocial psychopath: lack of empathy, inability to form genuine emotional bonds, need for control and domination, absence of remorse, and a grandiose sense of superiority. In his confessions, Little described the process of each murder with methodical detail. He wasn't impulsive. Each crime followed a calculated pattern. First, he would identify hunting grounds, prostitution areas, slums, near bars or bus stations. He would observe for hours, sometimes days, looking for potential victims who met his criteria: vulnerable, isolated, unlikely to be immediately missed. Second, he would establish contact. He would present himself as friendly, offering money for sexual services or simply a ride. He was convincing. Most of the victims accepted without suspecting any danger. Third, he would take them to secluded locations. It could be a dark alley, a vacant lot, or simply driving outside the city. He would initiate conversation, maintaining a facade of normalcy. Without warning, without provocation from the victim. He used his size and strength to quickly overpower them. He would place his hands around their neck or use an arm to compress their windpipe. The victims would struggle, but Little was considerably stronger than most. Fifth, he waited. Strangulation takes several minutes. Little described watching the life fade from his victim's eyes. This was the part he enjoyed most, the moment of absolute control, where he decided who lived and who died. Sixth, he disposed of the body. He simply left it where it was found or moved it to a dumpster, an abandoned lot, or a wooded area. He made no attempt to bury or conceal it elaborately. He trusted that the remote location and the victim's profile would mean minimal investigation. When investigators asked him how he felt about killing, Samuel Little was disturbingly honest. He didn't kill out of hatred. He didn't kill for revenge. He didn't kill to cover up other crimes. He killed because he enjoyed having absolute power over another person. It was like a drug, he explained in one of the recorded interviews. That moment when you look into her eyes and you know she's scared, that she knows what's going to happen, but she can't do anything. That's the moment. Forensic psychologists who analyzed his statements identified this as a classic pattern of sexual sadism. For Little, the act of killing was more gratifying than any sexual contact. The strangulation itself represented the moment of ultimate intimacy and control, an extreme perversion of human contact. He never sexually assaulted his victims after killing them. The act of strangling was his complete satisfaction. This also helped explain why so many cases were misclassified. Without evidence of rape, some investigators assumed different motives or even accidental deaths. One of Samuel Little's most disturbing characteristics was his extraordinary memory for visual details. He could recall with photographic precision the faces of women he had killed 40 or 50 years earlier. He remembered what clothes they wore, what jewelry they had on, the exact color of their lipstick. But he didn't remember their names. He never asked their names. To him, they weren't people with identities, histories, or families. They were objects, collections, memorial trophies in his mind. This dichotomy is common in psychopathic serial killers: exceptional memory for details that matter to them, physical appearance, circumstances of the crime, combined with complete indifference to the humanity of their victims. The drawings Little created in prison demonstrated this ability. Researchers were astonished by the accuracy of the details. When family members recognized their loved ones in these portraits, they frequently confirmed that the accessories or hairstyles were exactly as they remembered them from decades earlier. The question that haunted investigators, criminologists, and the public was simple: why did Samuel Little decide to confess after decades of silence? He had successfully evaded justice for most of his life. Even with a conviction for 3 murders, he could have remained silent about the other 90. Several factors contributed to her decision to speak out. First, age and health. At 72 when he was arrested, and physically deteriorating, Little knew he would die in prison. He had nothing left to lose. The possibility of additional charges didn't change his situation. He was already serving multiple life sentences. Second, the desire for recognition. Little had spent decades invisible, a minor criminal in the eyes of the system. By confessing to 93 murders, he guaranteed himself a place in history. He would be remembered as America's most prolific serial killer. His narcissistic ego craved that distinction. Third, the need for control, even in prison. By gradually releasing information, Little maintained power over the investigators. They needed what he knew. They came to him, treated him with respect, and listened attentively. After years of irrelevance, he was once again the center of attention. Fourth, he had developed a particular relationship with some investigators, especially Detective Mitzi Roberts. It wasn't genuine affection, psychopaths don't form real emotional bonds, but it was the closest thing to human connection Little could experience. The interviews gave him purpose, breaking the monotony of prison life. As Samuel Little spoke, each confession reopened wounds in families who had spent decades without answers. For some, the confirmation brought a painful but necessary closure. For others, it renewed the trauma with devastating intensity. Patricia Parker of Lubbock, Texas, received a call from a detective in 2019. Her mother, whom she hadn't heard from since 1985, had been murdered by Samuel Little. Patricia was 5 years old when her mother disappeared. She grew up not knowing what had happened to her, imagining scenarios, clinging to an irrational hope of being reunited. Now, 34 years later, she had answers. But the answers came with horrific details: how her mother died, the final moments of terror, the fact that her body was never properly identified. Story after story was repeated across the country. Children who grew up without mothers. Siblings who searched for years. Parents who died without knowing what had happened to their daughters. The damage caused by Samuel Little wasn't measured solely in 93 lives lost. It multiplied exponentially in hundreds, perhaps thousands, of family members and loved ones whose lives were permanently altered by his actions. Dr. Eric Hickey, a criminologist and expert on serial killers, analyzed Little's case for the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. His conclusion was disturbing. Samuel Little represented the almost perfect profile of a successful serial killer. He wasn't particularly intelligent in the conventional sense. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. His IQ was probably average. But he possessed exceptional practical intelligence. He instinctively understood how social and police systems work and how to exploit their weaknesses. He was patient, able to go months without killing when circumstances demanded it. He was mobile, never establishing routes that could be traced. He was careful, killing without weapons and minimizing forensic evidence. But above all, he chose his victims with calculated precision. It was no coincidence that he killed for decades without being caught. It was the result of systematically selecting victims that the system frequently ignored or only superficially investigated. Dr. Hickey concluded that there were probably dozens, perhaps hundreds, of serial killers operating with similar strategies in the United States. Criminals who aren't particularly intelligent, but who understand which victims they can attack with relative impunity. How many cases remained unsolved because they were misclassified? And how did investigators finally manage to connect the pieces of the biggest puzzle in American criminal history? FBI Crime Lab, Quantico, Virginia, 2012. Specialized technicians work with microscopic samples of genetic material. These samples come from cases decades old, evidence collected in the 1980s using techniques that were state-of-the-art at the time, but now seem primitive. DNA technology has advanced exponentially since its early forensic use in the 1990s. What once required coin-size samples can now be done with cells invisible to the naked eye. Genetic profiles that used to take weeks are now processed in days or hours. When Samuel Little's DNA was entered into Cody's after his arrest in Kentucky in 2012, the system began searching through millions of stored profiles for matches. Within minutes, it found 3 matches linked to unsolved homicide cases in Los Angeles. This was the moment that changed everything. Without DNA technology, Samuel Little would likely have died a minor criminal, his 93 murders remaining hidden forever. Mitzi Roberts had been a detective with the Los Angeles Police Department for more than 2 decades when she was assigned the Samuel Little case in 2012. Specializing in cold cases, Roberts had developed a reputation for her tenacity and her ability to build rapport with difficult suspects. When he reviewed Little's file, something caught his attention. It wasn't just the DNA linking him to 3 homicides. It was his criminal history, arrests in 26 states, multiple charges of violence against women, a pattern of constant mobility that perfectly matched the profile of an opportunistic serial killer. Roberts knew that if Little had killed 3 times in Los Angeles, he had probably killed many more times elsewhere. But he needed him to talk. Physical evidence in such old cases was often insufficient for additional convictions. He needed detailed confessions that could be corroborated. Her strategy was unconventional. Instead of aggressively confronting Little, she adopted an almost collaborative approach. She visited him regularly. They talked about art, about her childhood, about her travels around the country. She never judged him verbally. She listened. Slowly, Little began to open up. The first confessions were tentative, almost as if he were testing how far he could go. When Roberts responded with professional interest rather than moral horror, Little felt more comfortable sharing details. The Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, created by the FBI in 1985, was specifically designed to solve the problem that had allowed killers like Little to operate with impunity: the lack of communication between police jurisdictions. VICAP is a national database where local agencies can enter details of violent crimes, homicides, rapes, disappearances, and cases of unidentified persons. The system uses sophisticated algorithms to identify similarities between cases that may be connected. However, VICAP has a critical limitation. It relies on local police departments to input information. During the 1980s and 1990s, many small departments lacked the resources or training to use the system effectively. Even large departments often only entered cases they considered solvable or high priority. This meant that many of the murders committed by Little were never entered into VICAP, or were entered with incomplete information that prevented the system from identifying connections. But in 2017, when the FBI began to take Little's confessions seriously, VICAP became the central verification tool. Angelo Camacho, a senior analyst at VICAP, received an extraordinary assignment in 2017 to interview Samuel Little and verify each of his confessions against the National Crime Database. Camacho had access not only to VICAP, but also to databases of the National Criminal Information System, missing persons records, cold case files from hundreds of police departments, and decades of experience working in serial crime analysis. The process was meticulous. Little would describe a murder, the city, the approximate year, the victim's physical characteristics, the location where the body was left, and details of the crime. Camacho would then search databases for cases that matched those parameters. Little's accuracy was astonishing. He described killing an African-American woman in Covington, Kentucky, in 1984. He remembered that she had a gold tooth and that he left her near some railroad tracks. Camacho found a case: unidentified female body, African-American, found near railroad tracks in Covington, September 1984. The autopsy mentioned a gold tooth. The case had remained unsolved for 33 years. One by one, the confessions were verified. Odessa, Texas Police Department. Detective Esteban Flores reviews a dusty file from 1994. Denise Christie Brothers, 38, was reported missing on October 11. Her skeleton was found months later in a rural area. The cause of death was undetermined due to advanced decomposition. The case quickly went cold. In 2018, Flores receives a call from the FBI. Samuel Little has confessed to the murder of a woman in Odessa in October 1994. He describes the location, describes the victim, and describes how he killed her. Flores compares the confession with the file. Everything matches. 24 years later, he finally has answers. And he can finally give those answers to Denise's family. This scene was repeated in police departments across the United States. Cincinnati, Ohio, case closed. Miami, Florida, case closed. Pascagoula, Mississippi, case closed. Phoenix, Arizona, case closed. Detectives who had worked on these cases decades earlier, some now retired, were receiving phone calls they never expected. The cases that had kept them up at night, the faces of victims they could never forget, were finally seeing justice. But verifying confessions of crimes committed 30 or 40 years ago presented monumental challenges. Many police departments had destroyed old evidence. Some departments had merged or dissolved. Paper files had been lost in floods, fires, or simply bureaucratic mismanagement. Of Little's 93 confessions, the FBI was only able to definitively confirm 50 by the end of 2019. The other 43 remained under active investigation or impossible to verify. Some cases had no bodies. Little confessed to killing a woman in a specific city, but there were no matching missing women reports, nor were any bodies found. Was he lying? Or did no one simply report the disappearance, and the body was never discovered? Other cases had multiple potential victims. Little described killing a woman in Los Angeles in 1983, but dozens of women with similar profiles were found dead that year in that city. Without more specific details, verification was impossible. And in some cases, Little simply didn't remember enough details. He knew he'd killed someone in Georgia in the 1970s, but he couldn't recall the specific city or the exact year. With such vague information, finding the right case was like looking for a needle in a haystack. In some cases with preserved physical evidence, advances in forensic technology provided further confirmation. DNA analysis in 2018 was radically more sophisticated than in the 1980s or 1990s. In the case of Guadalupe Apodaca, murdered in Los Angeles in 1989, the original evidence had been stored in a police department freezer. Using modern techniques, technicians were able to extract enough DNA to create a profile that matched Little's. But DNA was only useful if there was preserved evidence. In most of Little's cases, particularly the older ones, no genetic material was available. The manual strangulation method didn't leave much forensic evidence. The bodies were often not thoroughly processed because the deaths were classified as accidents or overdoses. Verification then depended on circumstantial coincidences, the right location, the right time, matching physical characteristics, and details that only the killer could know. On November 27, 2018, the FBI made an unprecedented decision. They released a national press statement about Samuel Little, including his photograph, a summary of his confessions, and most importantly, 30 drawings Little had created of unidentified victims. They also launched a dedicated website, fbi.gov/Samuel-Little, with detailed information on each confirmed and suspected case. This included descriptions of victims, approximate dates, locations, and Little's drawings. The FBI made a direct appeal to the public. If anyone recognized a person in these drawings, if anyone had information about disappearances that might match, they should contact them immediately. The response was massive. The FBI received hundreds of calls in the first few weeks. Some were false alarms or cases of mistaken identity, but others provided vital leads. A brother in Ohio recognized a drawing by his sister who had disappeared in 1981. A daughter in Texas recognized the distinctive earrings her mother had worn in 1992. The Samuel Little case became the largest collaborative law enforcement effort in modern American history. Hundreds of detectives from dozens of agencies worked simultaneously, reviewing files, re-interviewing witnesses, and exhuming bodies when necessary. The FBI established a task force dedicated exclusively to coordinating these investigations. They created standardized verification protocols: what level of evidence was required to confirm a case, how to handle conflicting information, and how to communicate with victims' families. Police departments that normally operated completely independently now shared information seamlessly. Detectives in California compared notes with colleagues in Florida. Archivists in Georgia coordinated with analysts in Virginia. It was the kind of collaboration that, had it existed in the 70s or 80s, would probably have stopped Samuel Little decades earlier. By the end of 2019, the Samuel Little case had consumed thousands of hours of police work and cost millions of dollars in resources. Some people questioned whether it was worth it. Little was already serving life sentences. He was already a dying old man. Why spend so much effort verifying crimes that occurred decades ago? The answer came from the victims' families. For them, knowing what had happened to their loved ones was priceless. Decades of uncertainty, unanswered questions, irrational hopes, and even worse fears were finally over. Josephine Montalvo had searched for her sister for 36 years. In 2019, she finally received confirmation. Her sister had been murdered by Samuel Little in 1983. Josephine wept, not from grief but from relief. "Finally I can stop searching," she said. "Finally I can rest." That was the justification. It wasn't about punishing Little further. It was about giving peace to the families. But who were these women whose lives were taken? And what does this case tell us about how society values different lives? A wall in the FBI office in Quantico, Virginia, 2019. Dozens of drawings cover the surface. Faces of women looking straight ahead. Some smile gently. Others have neutral expressions. Each drawing includes specific details: hairstyle, eye shape, earrings, necklaces, even unique facial features like moles or scars. These are the portraits created by Samuel Little. For him, they were memorial trophies. For investigators, they were crucial clues. But for the families who would eventually recognize these faces, they were something far more painful: the last visual record of their loved ones, drawn by the man who murdered them. Behind every face was a story. A whole life reduced to a drawing on ordinary paper, created from memory by a psychopath. Carol Eileen Alford was 41 years old when she disappeared in Los Angeles in July 1987. She worked occasionally as a prostitute to support a drug addiction she had developed after years of personal trauma. She had had a difficult life: poverty, abuse, few opportunities. But Carol was also someone's daughter. She was someone's sister. She had friends who loved her. She had dreams that would never come true. Her body was found in a dumpster in a South Los Angeles alley. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation. The case was investigated, but with no witnesses, no significant forensic evidence, and limited resources dedicated to crimes in high-crime areas, it was eventually closed. For 25 years, Carol's murder remained unsolved. Then, in 2012, Samuel Little's DNA matched evidence from the scene. Carol Alford became one of the 3 victims whose murder led to Little's initial conviction. Finally, her family had answers. But the answers came with the devastating knowledge of how she died and how long it took to find justice. Audrey Everett Nelson was 35 years old when she was murdered in August 1989. She was a mother of 2. She struggled with addiction but maintained regular contact with her family. When she disappeared, her mother reported her missing immediately. Days later, Audrey's body was found in an industrial dumpster behind a commercial building in South Los Angeles. She had been strangled. She was wearing a yellow dress and high heels. She had no identification, but was quickly identified through fingerprints. The initial investigation was thorough by the standards of the time. Detectives interviewed people in the area. They collected forensic evidence. But there were no witnesses to the kidnapping or murder. There were no obvious suspects. The case eventually lost momentum. Audrey's mother, Rosie Nelson, spent 22 years without knowing who had killed her daughter. She regularly visited the police department asking for updates. She organized annual vigils. She never stopped seeking justice. In 2012, when Little's DNA matched, Rosie finally got her answer. She was 81 years old. She wept during the press conference where the conviction was announced. "I thought I would die without knowing," she said. "Thank God I lived to see this day." Denise Christie Brothers was 38 years old when she disappeared from Odessa, Texas, in October 1994. She was the mother of 3 children. She worked occasionally in local bars. She had a history of minor arrests for prostitution and drug possession. On October 11, 1994, Denise left her apartment saying she would be back in a few hours. She never returned. Her family reported her missing. The police launched a search, but with limited resources and dozens of other active cases, the investigation made little progress. Months later, a rancher found skeletal remains in a rural area near Odessa. They were identified as Denise's through dental records. Advanced decomposition made it impossible to determine a precise cause of death. With no useful forensic evidence and no witnesses, the case went cold. For 24 years, Denise's family lived with questions. What had happened to her? Had she suffered? Who was responsible? In 2018, Samuel Little confessed. He remembered killing a woman in Odessa in October 1994. He described her appearance. He described where he had left her. The details matched. Denise finally had justice. But her 3 children, now adults, had to process decades of renewed trauma. Of Little's 93 confessions, approximately 24 victims remain unidentified as of 2020. These are women whose bodies were found but never identified, or whose bodies were never found at all. The FBI continues to release Little's drawings of these unidentified victims, hoping that someone, somewhere, will recognize a missing loved one. One of these victims was described by Little as an African-American woman in her early 20s whom he killed near Miami in 1984. He remembered that she had short, curly hair and wore large hoop earrings. His drawing depicted these details with unsettling accuracy. But no one has claimed this portrait. There are no matching missing persons reports. It's possible this woman was never reported missing. It's possible her body was never found. It's possible she simply vanished off the face of the earth, and no one noticed or could do anything about it. This is perhaps the darkest reality of the Samuel Little case. How many victims were so marginalized, so invisible, that their absence did not even generate a police report? An analysis of Samuel Little's confirmed victims reveals a clear and devastating pattern. Approximately 80% were African American. Most had histories of drug addiction or alcoholism. Many worked in prostitution. Several were homeless. Nearly all came from situations of poverty and trauma. Little didn't choose these women at random. He chose them specifically because they were vulnerable. Because he knew the system would fail them. In conversations with investigators, Little was disturbingly candid about his selection process. "I looked for women that no one would miss," he admitted. "Women that the police wouldn't investigate too hard." This admission exposes an uncomfortable truth about the American criminal justice system. During the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and even to some extent today, the amount of resources devoted to investigating a homicide often depended on the victim's profile. A missing middle-class Caucasian woman would generate massive searches, national media coverage, and significant police resources. A missing African American woman with a drug addiction and a criminal record would often result in a routine police report and little follow-up action. Criminologist Stephen Egger coined the term "less dead" in the 1990s to describe this phenomenon. It refers to victims whose deaths receive less police and media attention due to their marginalized social status. Academic studies have repeatedly confirmed this bias. An analysis of homicide cases in multiple U.S. cities showed that cases with African American victims have significantly lower resolution rates than cases with Caucasian victims. Cases with victims who have a history of prostitution or drug use have even lower resolution rates. This is not necessarily the result of intentional racism or classism on the part of individual investigators. It is frequently the result of systemic factors: fewer resources allocated to departments serving low-income communities, implicit bias in case prioritization, a lack of witnesses willing to cooperate in high-crime areas, and media coverage that perpetuates narratives about which victims deserve attention. Samuel Little understood these factors intuitively and exploited them for 40 years. In the years following the revelations about Samuel Little, several families of victims spoke publicly about their experience. Martha Cunningham, sister of one of the victims, described how the police initially treated her sister's disappearance as just another prostitute who ran away. Days passed before they even filed a formal report. "They made us feel like her life didn't matter," Cunningham said. That because she'd had problems, because she'd done sex work, she somehow deserved less protection. Another family member described how the media extensively covered the murder of a Caucasian woman in their city, while the murder of their African American cousin barely warranted a mention. "They were both human beings," they said. "They both deserved the same respect, the same investigation." These families not only dealt with the trauma of losing a loved one violently, they also dealt with the trauma of feeling that the system did not value those lives as much as it valued others. Beyond the 93 women Samuel Little directly murdered, his legacy of destruction extends into concentric circles of grief. The children who grew up without mothers. The fathers who buried their daughters or spent decades not knowing if they were alive or dead. The siblings who carried survivor's guilt. The friends who never found closure. Patricia Parker of Lubbock, Texas, was 5 years old when her mother disappeared in 1985. She grew up in foster care, always wondering what had happened to her mother. She developed attachment issues, struggled with depression, and had difficulty maintaining relationships. In 2019, when she finally received confirmation that her mother had been murdered by Little, she was 39 years old. "All my life I've had this void," she said in an interview. "Questions without answers. Now I have answers, but the void is still there. My mother is still dead. I lost 34 years I could have had with her." This story is repeated 93 times. Each victim left behind people who loved them, who missed them, who never forgot them. In 2020, several organizations began initiatives to specifically honor the victims of Samuel Little. Not as statistics, not as cold, closed cases, but as human beings with stories, personalities, dreams, and inherent worth. The Remember Their Names project documented the biographies of each confirmed victim. They interviewed family members and friends. They collected photographs. They shared stories about who these women were before they became victims. Carol Alford loved to sing in church when she was young. Audrey Nelson made her children laugh with silly imitations. Denise Brothers was a talented cook who dreamed of opening a restaurant. These women were not defined by how they died or by the difficult circumstances of their lives. They were defined by their humanity, by the connections they formed, by the love they gave and received. At a vigil in Los Angeles in December 2019, a local pastor addressed a crowd gathered to honor the victims. Samuel Little wanted to make them invisible, he said. He chose victims he thought society would ignore. But he was wrong. Every one of these women mattered. Every one left a void that can never be filled. And we will remember them. How could the system have failed so completely for so many decades? And what changes were implemented to prevent another Samuel Little from operating with impunity? FBI Conference Room, Quantico, Virginia, January 2019. Federal agents, criminologists, representatives from police departments across the country, and public policy experts gather for an emergency summit. The topic: how did we allow Samuel Little to kill 93 people over 40 years without being apprehended? The answer is not simple. It wasn't a single failure, but a cascade of systemic failures that reinforced each other for decades. The Samuel Little case exposed deep flaws in how the United States investigates violent crimes, especially those affecting vulnerable populations. The main presentation is given by Dr. Robert Ressler, a pioneer in criminal profiling, who coined the term serial killer. Although retired, he was specifically invited to participate in this analysis. His conclusion is devastating. Little wasn't exceptionally intelligent. The system was exceptionally dysfunctional. The United States has approximately 18,000 law enforcement agencies, municipal police departments, county sheriff's offices, state police, and federal agencies. Each operates with considerable autonomy. This decentralization has benefits: local control and adaptation to specific community needs. But it also comes at a huge cost when it comes to serial crime. Samuel Little committed crimes in at least 19 states. Each crime was investigated, when it was investigated, by a different local agency. A murder in Los Angeles was handled by the LAPD. One in Odessa was handled by the Odessa Police. One in Cincinnati was handled by the Cincinnati Police. During the 1970s and 1980s, communication between these agencies was minimal. There were no integrated databases. There were no standardized protocols for sharing information about similar crimes. A detective in California had no easy way of knowing that a nearly identical case had occurred in Florida months earlier. Little constantly crossed state lines, exploiting precisely this fragmentation. He would kill in one city, then move to another. By the time a body was discovered and an investigation began, he was already hundreds or thousands of miles away. It's difficult for someone in 2020 to grasp how limited investigative tools were in the 1970s and 80s. There was no internet. There were no DNA databases. CODIS wasn't created until 1998. There was no instant communication between agencies. Criminal files were literally files, paper folders in metal cabinets. Criminal record information was shared by phone or fax, if at all. Photographs of suspects were physically distributed by mail. When Samuel Little was arrested in Mississippi in 1982, investigators had no easy way of knowing that he had been previously arrested in California, Florida, Ohio, and other states under slightly different names. They couldn't simply search a computer for African American male, 6 feet 6 inches tall, history of violence against women, and see all the related cases. The modern technology that eventually led to his capture, DNA databases, integrated computerized systems, digitized Vice EAP, simply did not exist for most of his criminal career. But technological limitations don't fully explain why Little operated with impunity. Even with limited technology, he could have been caught if his crimes had been investigated more rigorously. The harsh reality is that many of his crimes were not aggressively investigated because the victims were considered, implicitly or explicitly, less important. A 2017 Justice Department study analyzed homicide clearance rates in U.S. cities between 1980 and 2014. The findings were revealing. Homicides with Caucasian victims had a resolution rate of 63%. With African American victims, 47%. With Latino victims, 46%. Homicides in high-income neighborhoods, 68% resolution rate. In low-income neighborhoods, 42% resolution rate. When the victims had a history of arrests for prostitution or drugs, the rates dropped even further. Defenders of police departments argue that this is not necessarily intentional bias, but rather the result of limited resources and investigative realities. Cases involving victims from stable communities have more witnesses willing to cooperate. Families provide useful information quickly. The media generates public pressure. Politicians and community leaders demand results. Cases involving marginalized victims often lack these factors. Witnesses in high-crime areas are reluctant to speak to the police for fear of retaliation. Families may be estranged or lack the resources to exert pressure. The media frequently ignores these cases. There is no political pressure to allocate significant resources. A former homicide detective from a major city, speaking anonymously, was brutally honest. "We had 100 active cases. We didn't have enough detectives. We had to prioritize." A case with witnesses, clear evidence, a cooperative family, media pressure. That case got attention. A case of an unidentified sex worker found in an alley, no witnesses, no evidence. That case was quickly shelved. It wasn't that we didn't care. It was that we didn't have the resources to investigate everything thoroughly. This is the context in which Samuel Little operated. An overburdened system that made implicit judgments about which victims deserved intensive investigative resources. Another critical factor was the misclassification of causes of death. Many of Little's victims were found dead in circumstances that allowed for interpretations other than homicide. Manual strangulation, Little's preferred method, often leaves no obvious marks, especially if the body is not examined immediately. If a woman with a history of drug addiction is found dead and there are no obvious signs of violence, some medical examiners would conclude overdose or natural causes without a thorough investigation. In several of Little's confirmed cases, the deaths were initially classified as drug overdoses. Only decades later, when Little confessed and the files were reviewed, were the causes of death reclassified as homicide. This tendency to assume natural or accidental causes was particularly common with victims who had pre-existing health problems related to addiction, street life, or extreme poverty. The Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, was created specifically to solve the problem of interjurisdictional communication. Launched in 1985, VICAP was a national database where local agencies could enter information about violent crimes. The system would automatically look for patterns that might indicate serial crimes. In theory, VICAP should have identified Samuel Little in the 1980s or 1990s. A clear pattern existed: strangled women, frequently sex workers or addicts, found in multiple states over decades. So why did it fail? First, participation in VICAP was voluntary. Many small departments lacked the resources to dedicate staff to data entry. Medium-sized departments often only entered cases they already suspected were serial. Second, the quality of the data was inconsistent. Different agencies used different classification systems. What one agency classified as homicide by strangulation, another might classify as suspicious death. Third, many of Little's murders were never classified as homicides at all, therefore they were never entered into VICAP. By the time VICAP was digitized and improved in the 2000s, Little had completed most of his murders. Perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the case was that Samuel Little was arrested over 100 times during his lifetime. He was prosecuted for sexual assault, attempted murder, rape, and kidnapping. And he was repeatedly released or acquitted. In 1982, he was tried for the strangulation of Melinda Lapre in Mississippi. The evidence was solid. The victim initially survived and identified him. The crime scene was processed, a method consistent with other cases. But the jury found him not guilty. Successful defenses often relied on discrediting victims, highlighting their history of drug use or prostitution, suggesting they were unreliable. In 1984, he was arrested for murder and attempted murder in San Diego. Again, solid evidence. Again, the case was eventually dismissed due to procedural issues. The American criminal justice system is designed, appropriately, with protections for the accused. But in Little's case, these protections allowed a serial predator to continue killing. Following the revelation of the Samuel Little case, the FBI and the Department of Justice published a comprehensive report with recommendations to prevent similar situations in the future. The recommendations included mandatory participation in Vice EAP for all agencies receiving federal funding, standardization of cause-of-death classifications, improved protocols for investigating deaths of marginalized individuals, targeted training on implicit bias in case prioritization, additional resources for cold case units, better integration of state and federal databases. Some states began implementing these reforms. California created a task force specifically dedicated to cold cases of marginalized victims. Texas implemented enhanced reporting requirements for suspicious deaths. Florida increased funding for DNA testing in cold cases. But the most unsettling question remains unanswered: how many other Samuel Littles are currently operating? The FBI estimates that at any given time there are between 25 and 50 active serial killers in the United States. This estimate is based on analyses of unsolved cases with similar characteristics: multiple victims, geographic patterns, and consistent methods. Criminologist Thomas Hargrove, founder of the Murder Accountability Project, has analyzed statistics on unsolved homicides using computer algorithms. His analysis suggests that there could be more than 2,000 active serial killers whom the system has not yet identified as such. Many probably use strategies similar to Little's. They choose marginalized victims, move between jurisdictions, and kill in ways that allow for misclassification. The case of Samuel Little is not just the story of an individual monster. It is a mirror reflecting deep systemic flaws in how society protects, or fails to protect, its most vulnerable members. What happened in the last years of Samuel Little's life? And what does his legacy mean for American criminal justice? California State Medical Center, Lancaster, 2019. Samuel Little, now 79, is confined to a wheelchair. His health has deteriorated dramatically. He suffers from advanced diabetes, congestive heart disease, severe hypertension, and chronic kidney problems. Doctors estimate he has months, perhaps only weeks, to live. But his mind remains remarkably clear. He continues to receive visits from researchers across the country. Some come with specific cold case files, hoping for confirmation. Others simply interview him, documenting his confessions for the historical record. Little seems to enjoy these visits. They are the only variation in the monotony of his prison existence. They give him a sense of importance, that his life has meaning, even if that meaning is as the most prolific serial killer in American history. In a video interview recorded in March 2019, Little reflects on his life. "I did what I wanted to do," he says with chilling calm. "I lived the way I wanted to live. Nobody stopped me for 40 years. That says something. What it says, exactly, is open to interpretation." During the first months of 2019, Samuel Little provided his most detailed confessions. He seemed to feel a sense of urgency, as if he wanted to ensure that all his work was documented before he died. He describes crimes he had only briefly mentioned before. He provides additional details about already confirmed victims. He draws more portraits, some with annotations about where and when the murders occurred. In February, he confessed to the murder of a teenage girl in Omaha, Nebraska, in 1974. She was potentially his youngest victim, approximately 14 or 15 years old, according to his description. She was just a child, he admitted, but showed no remorse. He simply stated the fact. Investigators searched Nebraska archives. They found a case, an unidentified girl approximately 15 years old, found dead in a field in 1974. The cause of death was never definitively determined. The case remained unsolved for 45 years. In May 2019, the FBI updated its official statistics. Of Samuel Little's 93 confessions, 50 cases have been definitively confirmed through forensic evidence, historical records, and correlation of details. 15 cases are highly probable but lack absolute forensic confirmation. 28 cases remain without sufficient information to confirm or rule out. This means that between 50 and 65 murders can be attributed to Little with reasonable certainty. Even at the conservative figure of 50, he surpasses any other known serial killer in American history. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, confessed to 49 murders. Ted Bundy admitted to 30, though he is suspected of committing more. John Wayne Gacy killed 33. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, killed 10. Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17. Samuel Little surpasses them all. Forensic psychologists have extensively analyzed why some serial killers confess while others never admit their crimes. Ted Bundy denied it for years before partially confessing days before his execution. Gary Ridgway confessed as part of a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. Samuel Little confessed without any legal incentive. He was already serving a life sentence. There was no possibility of release. He couldn't negotiate a lesser sentence. Yet, he voluntarily provided detailed confessions to dozens of additional murders. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist who has interviewed numerous serial killers, offers an explanation. For narcissistic psychopaths like Little, confession satisfies multiple psychological needs. First, it gives them control. They decide what information to provide and when. Second, it gives them attention and recognition. Finally, they will be important, they will be remembered. Third, it allows them to relive their crimes, to re-experience the satisfaction they got from committing them. Little himself suggests something similar in an interview. All my life I was nobody. Just a small-time criminal. Now I'm somebody. Now people listen to me. They remember me. It is a perverse form of immortality. One of the most frustrating aspects for investigators is that Samuel Little confessed to murders where the bodies were never found. He described killing women in remote locations, leaving their bodies in areas where they would never be discovered. Dense forests, isolated rural areas, bodies of water. In some cases, it provides sufficiently specific locations for searches. Search teams with cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar technology, and forensic experts are exploring areas in Florida, California, and Georgia. Most of these searches turn up nothing. Decades have passed. The bodies have completely decomposed. The landscapes have changed. New buildings cover old vacant lots. Dozens of Samuel Little's victims will likely never be identified. Their families will never know what happened to them. They will remain missing forever, their fate known only to a dying old man in a California prison. Detective Mitzi Roberts, who conducted the initial interviews with Little, describes the psychological toll of working on the case. You hear these stories day after day, she explains. 93 women, 93 lives. And he describes them as if he were talking about going shopping or watching television. No emotion, no remorse. It's hard to process that level of dehumanization. Roberts eventually needed to take a break from the case. He developed symptoms of vicarious trauma, difficulty sleeping, anxiety, and intrusive thoughts about the victims. He sought professional counseling, something that still carries a stigma in some police cultures but is increasingly recognized as necessary. Other researchers reported similar experiences. FBI analyst Angelo Camacho describes reviewing hundreds of cold case files, viewing crime scene photographs, and reading autopsies. It affects you, he admits. You start to see the world differently. You become more aware of how much violence exists, how much suffering. The Samuel Little case not only traumatized the victims' families, but also left psychological scars on many of the professionals who worked to solve the crimes. In October 2019, Samuel Little received his final sentence. Although he was already serving multiple life sentences for murders in California and Texas, Ohio filed charges for 2 additional murders in that state. Little did not fight the charges. He pleaded guilty. The judge imposed 2 additional life sentences, to be served consecutively with his existing sentences. In practical terms, this changed nothing. Little was going to die in prison anyway. But symbolically it was important. Each formal conviction officially acknowledged that a life had been unjustly taken. It was justice delayed, but justice nonetheless. During the sentencing in Ohio, family members of the two victims were able to make powerful statements. A sister spoke through tears about how she had searched for her sister for 35 years. A son spoke about growing up without a mother, about the unanswered questions that haunted him his entire life. Samuel Little listened in silence. He showed no visible emotion. When offered the opportunity to speak, he declined. In November 2019, journalists from the television program 60 Minutes gained access to interview Samuel Little. The nationally broadcast interview introduced Little directly to the American public. The images were shocking. An elderly man in a wheelchair, connected to medical monitors, calmly discussing the strangulation of 93 women. The juxtaposition between his frail appearance and the monstrosity of his crimes was difficult to process. When the interviewer asked if he felt remorse, Little answered honestly, "Not really. I feel like I got caught. But I don't feel remorse for the women." This admission confirmed what psychologists already knew. Samuel Little was a classic psychopath, incapable of genuine empathy or moral remorse. The interview generated controversy. Some argued that giving him a media platform glorified his crimes. Others defended the journalistic value of documenting and understanding extreme criminal behavior. During the last months of 2019, Samuel Little's health deteriorated rapidly. He could no longer walk. He required assistance with basic activities. His kidney function declined to the point where dialysis was necessary. Doctors estimated that without dialysis, he would die within weeks. With dialysis, he could live for several more months. Little initially agreed to the treatment, but in December decided to stop. He essentially chose to die. Visits from researchers became less frequent. She no longer had the energy for lengthy interviews. She spent most of her time sleeping or semi-conscious. On December 30, 2020, Samuel McDowell Little died at California State Medical Center. He was 80 years old. The official cause of death was heart and kidney failure. There was no funeral, no visitors in his final hours. His body was cremated and the ashes were handled by the state. There is no marker, no grave, no memorial. Samuel Little wanted to be remembered as America's most prolific serial killer. In that, he succeeded. But beyond that grim recognition, he died alone and forgotten, exactly as he had lived most of his life. The death of Samuel Little did not bring complete closure. Approximately 40 of his confessions remained unconfirmed. Several victims were never identified. Some families never received definitive answers. But his death did mark the end of a dark chapter in American criminal history. The man who had evaded justice for 40 years had finally faced consequences. Not all he deserved. The death penalty would have been considered appropriate by many, but at least he died in prison, stripped of his freedom and dignity. For the families of his victims, his death evoked mixed emotions. Some felt relief that he was no longer breathing the same air. Others felt he had taken the easy way out, dying of natural causes instead of facing execution or more decades of imprisonment. Rosie Nelson, mother of victim Audrey Nelson, summed up the feelings of many. "I'm glad she's dead. But her death doesn't bring my daughter back. It doesn't erase 30 years of pain. It just means it's finally over." What lessons remain from the Samuel Little case? And how has it changed the way the United States confronts serial crime and protects its most vulnerable citizens? Boston University, Department of Criminology, February 2021. Professor James Allen Fox, one of America's leading experts on serial killers, delivers a lecture entitled The Samuel Little Case: Lessons for the 21st Century. Samuel Little represents a turning point in how we understand serial crime, Fox explains to a room full of students and academics. For decades, the American public was obsessed with killers like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, charismatic, often Caucasian criminals whose victims came from middle-class backgrounds. These cases received massive media attention. But little showed us a darker reality. The typical serial killer is not a manipulative genius. He is an opportunistic predator who exploits systemic failures. And his victims are not young, Caucasian, suburban women. They are marginalized people whom society frequently ignores. The Samuel Little case forced criminological academia to re-examine fundamental assumptions about who commits these crimes, who the victims are, and why some cases are solved while others remain unsolved for decades. Following the revelation of the Little case, the FBI implemented significant reforms to the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. Director Christopher Wray announced in March 2020 a $50 million investment to modernize and expand the system. The improvements included improved reporting requirements. Agencies that receive federal funding must now enter all unsolved homicides into VICAP, not just those suspected of being serial. Artificial intelligence algorithms. The system now uses machine learning to identify patterns that human analysts might miss. Integration with state databases. VICAP now automatically connects with state criminal information systems, eliminating duplication and improving accuracy. Standardization of terminology. All participating agencies now use standardized classifications for methods of murder, victim characteristics, and circumstances, making it easier to identify patterns. Proactive analysis. Instead of just responding to inquiries, VICAP now generates automatic alerts when entered cases show suspicious similarities. These reforms came too late for Samuel Little's victims. But they will potentially save future lives by identifying serial killers earlier in their criminal careers. Inspired directly by the Little case, several states launched massive initiatives to review cold cases, especially those with marginalized victims who historically received less investigative attention. California created the Justice for Forgotten Victims Task Force, with an annual budget of $20 million. The group is dedicated exclusively to reinvestigating unsolved homicides of sex workers, homeless people, drug users, and other vulnerable populations. Texas implemented Project Dignity, which uses modern DNA technology to re-examine evidence from cases dating back to the 1970s and 1980s. In its first year, the project confirmed links in 18 previously unconnected cases, identifying at least 3 possible active serial killers. Florida established a specific database to track violent deaths of sex workers, recognizing that this population is particularly vulnerable to serial victimization. The database cross-references referrals with arrests by solicitation and unsolved murders, looking for geographic and temporal patterns. The FBI and several state police academies developed training programs specifically designed to address implicit biases in criminal investigations. The modules include bias recognition, training officers to identify when their own assumptions about the value of different victims might be affecting resource allocation. Standardized protocols, establish uniform procedures for investigating homicides regardless of the victim's profile. Community engagement, techniques for building trust with marginalized communities, facilitating witness cooperation. Trauma sensitivity, understanding how trauma and addiction affect witness reliability without automatically dismissing their testimony. The Los Angeles Police Department, where Samuel Little committed many of his crimes, made this training mandatory for all homicide detectives. Detective Mitzi Roberts, who interviewed Little, now regularly teaches these modules. We have to confront an uncomfortable truth, Roberts says in one of these training sessions. For decades, our system valued some lives more than others. It wasn't necessarily conscious or malicious, but the result was the same. Some killers were able to operate with impunity because they chose the right victims. That has to stop. One of the most promising developments post-Little has been the retrospective application of modern DNA technology to old cases. Advances in genetic sequencing have made it possible to extract usable profiles from evidence that a decade ago was considered inadequate. The Department of Justice launched the National Cold Case DNA Initiative in 2021 with $100 million in funding. The program provides funding to local departments to reanalyze evidence from cold cases using modern technology. The results have been remarkable. In its first year, the program helped solve more than 200 cold cases nationwide, some over 40 years old. Several of these cases involved potential victims of previously unidentified serial killers. The case of a serial killer in Connecticut was solved when DNA from cases in 1987, 1990, and 1993 was re-examined using modern technology, revealing that all had been committed by the same person, a 68-year-old man who had never been a suspect. For the families of Samuel Little's victims, closure came with complex and often conflicting emotions. Confirmation of what had happened to their loved ones brought relief, but it also reopened trauma that some had spent decades trying to process. Organizations that support families of homicide victims reported a surge in service requests after the Little case became public. Many families who had remained silent for years suddenly needed emotional and psychological support. The National Foundation for Families of Homicide Victims created a specialized program for families affected by serial killings. The program recognizes that these families face unique challenges: the public nature of the case, media attention, and the knowledge that their loved one was one of many victims. Josephine Montalvo, who searched for her sister for 36 years before receiving confirmation of her death at Little's hands, became an advocate for other families. "The waiting was torture," she explains. "But in a way, the answers are torture too. Now I know exactly how my sister died, how much she suffered. Sometimes ignoring was easier. But I prefer to know. I prefer the truth, no matter how painful it is." The Little case also exposed problems in how causes of death are determined and classified. Multiple victims were initially misclassified as overdoses or natural deaths when in fact they were homicides. The National Association of Medical Examiners issued new guidelines in 2020 for investigating the deaths of people with histories of addiction or marginalization. The guidelines emphasize complete autopsies, even when the cause seems obvious. Perform a thorough examination. Enhanced photographic documentation, photographing injuries that might not be immediately apparent but may reveal violence. Consult with experts. When there is any ambiguity, consult with forensic pathologists specializing in trauma. Preservation of evidence, maintaining biological samples indefinitely for possible future re-examination. Several states reformed their medical examiner systems, eliminating the elected coroner model, where the medical examiner is an elected official without necessarily medical training, in favor of certified professional forensic pathologists. The Samuel Little case reignited a long-standing debate in criminology. Should society publicize serial killers? Does publishing their names, photographs, and detailed confessions glorify their crimes and potentially inspire copycats? The FBI defended its decision to publicize the case widely, arguing that the publicity helped identify victims and solve cold cases. Without Little's images and drawings circulating nationally, many families would never have received answers. But critics point out that Little clearly enjoyed the attention. His confessions were partly motivated by a desire for recognition and fame. By giving him exactly what he wanted, did the system reward his behavior? Dr. Park Dietz, a prominent forensic psychiatrist, suggests a balanced approach. We need enough publicity to solve crimes and identify victims, but we must be careful in how we frame the narrative. The focus should be on the victims, their stories, their humanity. The killer should be presented as necessary information, not as a fascinating or impressive figure. Some organizations are now advocating for a no-name killer policy in media coverage, referring to criminals only by generic designations while focusing attention on the victims. This practice has been adopted by several media outlets in New Zealand and is gaining support in the United States. By the end of 2020, approximately 40 of Samuel Little's confessions remained unconfirmed. Of these, at least a dozen involve victims who were never identified. The FBI maintains an active website dedicated to the case, displaying Little's drawings of these unknown victims. Every year, new leads are received. Some lead to identifications. Others turn out to be false alarms. In March 2021, a woman in Arkansas recognized a drawing by her sister who had disappeared in 1984. For 37 years, she had assumed her sister had simply decided to cut off contact with the family. She never reported a disappearance because she thought it was voluntary. The confirmation that her sister had been murdered was devastating, but it also provided closure. Similar stories continue to emerge. Each identification is a small victory, a life finally recognized, a family finally with answers. But other victims will likely never be identified. There are no matching missing persons reports. No relatives searching. They are the truly forgotten, whose lives ended without anyone noticing their absence. Memorial Park, Los Angeles, California, October 2022. A ceremony commemorates the 10th anniversary of Samuel Little's arrest. Family members of victims gather along with investigators, victims' attorneys, and community representatives. A new memorial has been erected, a granite wall with 93 names engraved on it. They are the confirmed victims of Samuel Little. Some have full names. Others are listed as Unidentified Victim, Miami, 1984, or Jane Doe, Cincinnati, 1981. But all are present, all are acknowledged. Retired Detective Mitzi Roberts addresses the assembled crowd. This memorial is not for the man who committed these crimes, she says. It is for the women whose lives he took. Women who were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends. Women who had dreams and hopes. Women who deserved protection and justice, but whom the system failed. We cannot undo what happened. We cannot bring these lives back to them. But we can make sure they are remembered. And we can work to ensure that no one else is forgotten or ignored in the way these women were. Patricia Parker, who was 5 years old when her mother was murdered by Little in 1985, touches her mother's name carved into the granite. She is now 42, older than her mother ever was. My mother wasn't perfect, she said in a brief statement. She struggled with addiction. She made choices that weren't always good. But she was human. She was my mother. And she deserved to live. All these women deserve to live. The ceremony ends with a moment of silence. 93 seconds, one for each life lost. The silence is profound, heavy with the weight of all that was stolen, all the questions that remained unanswered for decades, all the pain these families carried. FBI Files, 2025. The Samuel Little case officially remains open in some jurisdictions where confessions have not yet been corroborated. But actively, the investigation has concluded. The perpetrator is dead. Most of the victims have been identified. The lessons learned have been documented. What does the case of Samuel Little teach us? First, it shows us the devastating consequences of systemic inequality. When society marginalizes certain groups, the homeless, sex workers, drug users, racial minorities, it creates vulnerable populations that predators can exploit with relative impunity. Second, it demonstrates the critical importance of communication and coordination among law enforcement agencies. In the modern era of integrated databases and computerized analysis, patterns that would have remained hidden in the 1970s can now be quickly identified. Third, it emphasizes the value of never giving up in seemingly innocuous cases. Technology is constantly advancing. Evidence that was useless decades ago may be crucial today. Families who waited 30 or 40 years finally received answers. Fourth, it reminds us that behind every statistic is a real person. 93 is not just a number. It represents 93 individual lives, each with its own story, its own relationships, its own inherent worth. And finally, the case of Samuel Little challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about which lives we value as a society and which lives we frequently ignore. The fact that one man was able to kill 93 people over 40 years is not just a story about an individual monster. It is a story about systemic failures that allowed that monster to operate. The reforms implemented after the Little case are steps in the right direction. But the work is far from finished. As long as inequality exists, as long as certain lives are considered less valuable than others, there will be predators ready to exploit those vulnerabilities. True justice for the victims of Samuel Little is not just that their killer died in prison. It is ensuring that the systems that failed to protect them are fundamentally reformed so that no one else is forgotten in the same way. 93 women lost their lives. They cannot be brought back. But their legacy can be a more equitable justice system, a more just society, and a commitment that every life, regardless of the circumstances, deserves protection, dignity, and justice. This is the final lesson of the Samuel Little case. And it's a lesson we cannot afford to forget.